This war involving Iran. Why is the United States so determined to fight it? The answer has never really been nuclear weapons nor religious theocracy, but rather a system that has been operating for 50 years. The US relies on it to use printed paper to purchase real assets from the entire world. That system is the petrodollar. Whoever manipulates this system becomes a target of the US. Iraq was dealt with, Libya was dealt with, and now it's Iran's turn. But this isn't just a game between great powers. The price of oil you pay, the cost of goods you buy, and how much the money in your pocket is worth, all are bound by this system. It originated from a secret agreement 50 years ago, a global crisis, and a lie that changed history. This story begins with a Frenchman. In the 1960s, French President Charles de Gaulle did something that the United States simply could not ignore. He secretly ordered all of France's gold stored at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to be returned to Paris. Over 3 years, through 44 ship voyages and 129 flights, more than 3,000 tons of gold were transported back. You heard that right, 3,000 tons, shipped home vessel by vessel. This is not a movie, this is real history. Why did he dare to do this? Because at the time, there was an iron rule, recognized worldwide. $35 equaled 1 ounce of gold. It was clearly written in the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. If you held US dollars, you could exchange them for gold at any time. Where did this rule come from? It's simple. World War II left Europe in ruins, and countries used gold to purchase weapons and supplies from the United States. After the war, calculations showed that more than 60% of the world's gold was stored in US vaults. Whoever had the gold had the power, and thus, the US dollar became the global, king currency. But de Gaulle ran the numbers and discovered a fatal flaw. The global economy was growing rapidly, and countries increasingly needed more US dollars to conduct business. But gold could not increase on its own. In other words, the US promise to exchange dollars for gold at any time was mathematically impossible to sustain. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War erupted in the 1960s. US military spending surged like floodwaters behind a dam, financed largely by printing money. But the gold reserves did not increase by even a single gram. De Gaulle saw through it. This was essentially a Ponzi scheme. Whoever withdrew first would be safe. France took the lead in exchanging dollars for gold. Britain, Germany, and Japan quickly followed. A global crisis targeting the US dollar erupted. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon appeared on national television and made a statement that changed history. The US dollar will no longer be convertible into gold. In plain terms, we owe you gold, but we won't pay. The dollar plummeted overnight. The system collapsed, and the world was stunned. Without gold backing, what is a dollar but a piece of paper? But what the United States did next was the real masterstroke that reshaped the world. The dollar could not be allowed to die. If it became mere paper, the United States would fall from global dominance to becoming the world's largest debtor nation. So the dollar urgently needed a new anchor, a new source of credibility. This anchor had to meet 2 conditions. The entire world could not live without it, and the United States had to be able to control it. Looking at the world in the 1970s, only one thing met both conditions: oil. You might think oil is just gasoline at the pump, unrelated to your life. But look around. Your phone's plastic casing is made from oil. The medicine you take, the shampoo you use, the packaging for deliveries, all are petroleum byproducts. Each year, the world consumes over 36 billion barrels of oil. Only half is burned as fuel. The other half becomes almost everything in your daily life. Oil is not optional. It is the underlying code of modern civilization, even more fundamental than gold. The issue was, the US didn't just want enough oil for itself. It wanted global pricing power and control over how oil was traded. If every barrel of oil were bought and sold in US dollars, then the dollar would always have demand. At that time, the world's largest oil producer was Saudi Arabia, a monarchy where all oil resources and power were concentrated in the hands of a royal family. Meanwhile, Iran had just undergone a revolution. Its king was overthrown almost overnight. The Saudi royal family clearly understood, without strong backing, they could be next at any moment. One side desperately needed oil tied to the dollar. The other desperately needed a powerful protector to survive. But having mutual needs wasn't enough. Someone had to light the fuse first. In 1973, the Fourth Middle East War broke out. Arab countries collectively imposed an oil embargo and oil prices quadrupled. At last, the United States got the rare opportunity it had been waiting for. So in 1974, under the leadership of Henry Kissinger, the US put forward a set of conditions that would change the world. First, Saudi Arabia would sell oil exclusively in US dollars. Second, it would persuade all OPEC members, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, to also accept only US dollars. Third, the dollars earned would be used to purchase US Treasury bonds and American weapons. In return, the United States would guarantee the security of the Saudi royal regime. If anyone dared to threaten you, the US military would take care of it. Saudi Arabia agreed. From that moment on, nearly every barrel of oil traded on Earth had to be priced in US dollars. Every country in the world had to first earn dollars, store dollars, and use dollars. The dollar transformed from a gold-backed note into a ticket of entry to the oil market. This system is known as the petrodollar, and its power is even more formidable than you might imagine. Let me explain just how powerful the petrodollar is with the simplest possible loop. The entire world needs dollars to buy oil. Oil-producing countries sell oil to earn dollars, then turn around and use those dollars to buy US Treasury bonds. The United States uses that money to keep spending, and only after spending does it print more. The newly printed dollars flow across the world, and the world again uses them to buy oil. This cycle repeats endlessly. Do you see it now? This is essentially a perpetual machine. The United States achieved what every nation has dreamed of, using printed paper to exchange for the real wealth of the entire world. The French at the time called it the exorbitant privilege, but that's still not the most ruthless part. The most ruthless part is this: when the US prints money, the entire world pays the price. The reason is simple. Because of oil, all countries are forced to hold large reserves of US dollars. When the US prints more money, the dollar depreciates, and so do the dollar reserves you hold. It's like a pot of porridge. The US secretly pours in a bucket of water, making everyone else's bowl thinner and thinner. Meanwhile, the one who added the water scoops out the excess porridge to exchange for real goods. In general, the most common method is buying US Treasury bonds. To put it bluntly, it means lending money to the US government in exchange for a bit of interest. You've probably heard in the news about the massive figure of $36 trillion in US national debt. Where does that money come from? From the entire world lending to the United States. Have you also noticed that every time the Federal Reserve announces interest rate hikes or cuts, the whole world becomes tense? The reason lies here. Because all countries are forced to hold large amounts of dollar-denominated assets, any US interest rate decision directly affects the value of money in everyone's hands. But the harshest reality is this: whether rates go up or down, whether money is printed or tightened, these decisions are made entirely by the United States according to its own needs. Other countries have no vote, they can only passively accept. If the US wants to stimulate its economy, it prints and injects money, shrinking the value of the dollars you hold. If it wants to curb inflation, it sharply raises interest rates, causing global capital to flow back to the US, while your currency and stock markets suffer. How much you earn or lose is not determined by you, but by the United States. In that sense, the whole world is effectively working for the US. It's just that ordinary people like us don't realize it. Think about it. Every time conflict erupts in the Middle East, oil prices surge, the world panics. Where does the money go? Still into the US dollar. Because the dollar is the world's #1 safe haven currency. The more chaotic things become, the more capital flows into dollar-denominated assets. And reality reflects this. Whenever tensions involving Iran escalate, the US dollar index rises sharply, and oil prices surge to their highest levels since 2022. Other countries get hit from both sides. Rising oil prices push up import costs, while capital outflows and currency depreciation worsen the situation. And what about the United States? After the shale oil revolution, the US has become the world's largest oil producer. High oil prices bring enormous profits to its energy corporations. Others are bombed, while the US counts its money. Of course, the dominance of the US dollar today is no longer based solely on oil. But without the global payment foundation created by oil and the dollar, the financial dominance of Wall Street and the technological dominance of Silicon Valley could never have begun. But having just a harvesting machine is still not enough. The United States also possesses a lethal weapon to discipline countries that refuse to comply. Imagine that banks around the world transfer money within the same WeChat group to conduct business. If you want to buy oil or engage in cross-border trade, all USD flows must pass through this group. This group is called SWIFT, and the United States is effectively its owner. If you anger the owner of this group, they can do 3 things at any time. First, kick you out of the group. Cut off your access to SWIFT, making it impossible for you to do business with the world. Second, freeze your wallet. The money you hold in US banks can become completely inaccessible overnight. Third, threaten your friends, incite sanctions. Anyone who dares to do business with you will also be punished. In reality, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have all experienced this combination. At best, trade paralysis. At worst, foreign exchange reserves disappearing overnight. In this way, the United States doesn't even need to fire a single shot to suffocate a country's economy. But what if financial measures aren't enough? What if someone is not afraid of sanctions and tries to bypass the dollar? Then real bullets will be used. In history, every country that has attempted to challenge oil and the US dollar has paid a painful price. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraqi oil would be traded in euros. Of course, there were many reasons for the US invasion of Iraq, but Saddam had touched a red line that could not be crossed. Leading by example was enough for the US to kill the chicken to warn the monkey. 3 years later, American tanks rolled into Baghdad, and Saddam was dragged out of a hole. The first thing after the war? Iraqi oil transactions returned to the US dollar. Still not convinced? In 2010, Muammar Gaddafi died. He had been promoting a plan for all of Africa to use gold to settle oil transactions, completely bypassing the dollar. 1 year later, NATO launched airstrikes on Libya, and Gaddafi died in a chaotic civil war. Do you see a pattern? First, financial tools are used to choke you. If that doesn't hurt enough, then military force follows. But there is one country that has been under sanctions for decades, not only surviving, but deliberately building an alternative payment network to bypass the US dollar, even signing oil agreements in yuan with China. That country is Iran. Moreover, Iran is not fighting alone. More and more major oil-producing powers are beginning to align, shifting from individually following the dollar to a collective pivot among producers. Prolonged sanctions have forced the creation of payment infrastructure that does not rely on the dollar, and Iran has become a model for this transition. Objectively speaking, the dollar still accounts for about 58% of global foreign exchange reserves and nearly 88% of foreign exchange transactions, far from collapse. But the urgency for the United States lies in this. Once Iran opens this path, more and more countries will follow. Once a trend of moving away from the dollar forms, it becomes very difficult to reverse. Therefore, the US choice is to act before the trend becomes reality. In 2026, missiles fall on Tehran. On one hand, this forces Iranian oil back into the dollar-based settlement system. On the other hand, it cuts off the largest physical supply node in the non-dollar payment network, killing the chicken to warn the monkey, showing all oil-producing countries what happens when you challenge the petrodollar. But attacking Iran has an even deeper layer of reasoning, geography. You might ask, the US already produces enough shale oil for itself, so why still care about Middle Eastern oil? Because what the US wants to control is not the oil itself, but the flow of oil. Look at a map. Iran sits at the Strait of Hormuz. Nearly 30% of the world's seaborne oil passes through this narrow choke point. About 80% of China's oil imports pass through here, and the same goes for Japan, South Korea, and Europe. The United States does not lack oil, but its competitors do. Whoever controls this narrow strait controls the lifeline of energy for those countries. Whoever controls the strait holds the master switch of global energy distribution, the biggest bargaining chip on the international negotiating table. So now you understand, on the surface, it is about attacking Iran, but in reality, it is about protecting the US dollar. And what it truly aims to block is the energy lifeline of all its rivals. At this point, it may seem that the United States wins completely, printing money to exchange for real assets, sanctioning whoever it wants, striking whoever it chooses. Does this system have no weaknesses? It does, and in fact, it contains a fatal flaw written deep into its source code. In economics, there is a fundamental rule called the Triffin dilemma. If you want to be the issuer of the world's dominant currency, you must run long-term trade deficits, spending dollars abroad and distributing them globally so that the world has enough dollars to buy oil and conduct trade. But how do you distribute dollars globally? Through imports. The more you import, the less your domestic industries can survive. In 1979, U.S. manufacturing accounted for 20% of GDP. By 2024, it had fallen to less than 10%. In the Rust Belt, millions of workers lost their jobs, and generations of technical expertise came to a halt the day assembly lines stopped running. This is not a policy mistake, it is the structural cost of maintaining dollar hegemony. Now you can understand why Donald Trump has spent years calling for manufacturing to return to the United States. This is destined to remain a political slogan that cannot truly be realized. If you want dollar dominance, you must accept trade deficits. If you want factories to return, you must give up the dollar's global status. You can only choose one side. This is mathematics, not politics. And the cost of this harvesting machine goes even further. Do not forget, the United States is facing a battlefield of over $36 trillion in national debt. Annual interest payments alone exceed $1 trillion, higher than the defense budget. In the federal budget, nearly one-fifth goes toward paying interest. Meanwhile, war itself is an even more aggressive money-burning machine than any harvesting system. Daily costs for rebuilding bases, consuming munitions, and maintaining carrier strike groups are all enormous. Each expense is staggering. This is not a pace that a country carrying $36 trillion in debt can sustain indefinitely. And Iran is betting on exactly this, not through direct confrontation, but through prolonging the conflict. As long as the war does not end, oil prices will not fall. The fiscal deficit of the United States will only widen further. At the same time, the backlash against dollar-based credit is accelerating. Freezing $300 billion of Russia's reserves, removing Iran from SWIFT, each use of the dollar as a weapon sends a message to the world. The money you hold here moves only if I say so. What do you think other countries will conclude? Naturally, they will rush to find a way out. Central banks around the world are rapidly accumulating gold. Saudi Arabia has begun accepting yuan. India and the United Arab Emirates are conducting oil trade in rupees. 50 years ago, Kissinger used a secret agreement to compel the world to use the US dollar. 50 years later, more and more countries are quietly building escape routes for themselves. To maintain this money-printing machine, the United States is forced to continuously engage in conflict, but each conflict widens the cracks a little more. That said, we must remain objective. In the short term, the US dollar, US Treasury bonds, and the US military will not collapse. This is a giant that has been operating for half a century. Its inertia, scale, and safe haven status cannot be shaken easily by a few wars. The cracks are real, but the opponent is still strong. How long this machine can keep running, no one knows. But peace has never fallen from the sky. The law of the jungle has never left the stage. Faced with such a powerful force, the only thing we can do is abandon illusions, prepare to struggle, and in the end, wish for peace in the world.